21. The Israelite conquests and migrations to Greece. The earliest Greek writers described the Hellenes, the Greeks, as 4 distinct tribes, each with their own Greek dialects and subdialects. The Ionians, the Aeolians, the Danaans, and the Dorians. Later Greek tribes come from these 4. The Ionians were Javan from Japheth, and whilst the other 3 were Israelites, most likely the Aeolians came from the Israelite Phoenicians, which we'll cover in the next proof. Diodorus Siculus, the 1st century BC Greek historian, gave an account of the Hebrew Exodus from Egypt, but from the Egyptian point of view. The aliens, the Israelites, were driven from the country, Egypt, and the most outstanding and active amongst them banded together and, as some say, were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions. Their leaders were notable men, chief among them being Danaus and Cadmus, but the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea. The colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and for his courage. Danaus was known as the Egyptian and was said to have led the Danaans to Greece. No doubt the name Danaans comes from the tribe of Dan, but the historian Homer also called them Achaeans and the Argives, and that's because the Danaans initially colonized the Achaea region and its major city Argos. As Diodorus explains, they say also that those who set forth with Danaus, likewise from Egypt, settled what is practically the oldest city in Greece, Argos. Danaus and the Danaans would have arrived around the time of the Exodus in 1450 BC, when Greece was primarily inhabited by the Ionians, Japhethites. On the other hand, Cadmus was called the Phoenician, although the timing is slightly off as the Phoenicians came later after the Israelites had conquered Canaan. Nevertheless, this shows that people knew that the Danaans and Phoenicians were related people and had a common origin in the Exodus. Modern archaeologists and historians obfuscate and hide the name Danaans and describe their settlements as the Mycenaean civilization, after their ancient capital city, Mycenae, and this is where King Agamemnon ruled and formed a coalition to attack the Trojans. Mycenae was destroyed in ancient times by the invading Dorians, who arrived later in the 12th century BC, but modern historians claim that no one knows what happened to the Mycenaean civilization or caused its collapse, but by reading the classic history it's clear the cause was the Dorians' arrival. The Dorians were Israelites who arrived in Greece 3 generations after the Trojan War. They originated from the seaport Dor in Manasseh's territory, hence the name Dorians, which means people of Dor. Many modern historians deceptively claim that the Dorians invaded the Peloponnesus from the north, where they largely supplanted the Danaans and took over their cities such as Corinth and Sparta, but this is sheer conjecture. We need to return to Homer and his descriptions of the Greek world of the 12th century BC. Homer identifies the Dorians as one of the tribes present on the island of Crete, not as a tribe approaching from the north, and the Dorians are said to have invaded Greece from the seas, and Crete was the natural layover point between the seaport of Dor and Greece. The Dorians could have more easily launched an invasion from Crete. It is likely the Dorian invasion which gradually led to some of the Danaans fleeing and sailing through the Mediterranean, eventually arriving in Ireland, where they are commonly referred to in history as the Tuatha de Danaan, which literally means the tribe of Dan. Furthermore, historian Flavius Josephus, in Book 12 of his Antiquities, records a letter that the king of Sparta sent to the high priest at Jerusalem, probably around 160 BC. Arius, king of the Lacedaemonians, to Aeneas sends greetings. We have met with a certain writing whereby we have discovered that both the Judeans and the Lacedaemonians are of the same family and are derived from the kindred of Abraham. Here we see that the Spartans, here called Lacedaemonians, knew that they were related to the Israelites. King Arius ended the letter thusly: "This letter is 4 square and the seal is an eagle with a dragon in its claws. The eagle was one of the signs of the tribe of Israel." Israel. Previously, Judah had been blessed and assured that the scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet. In other words, Judah's descendants would be kings, would rule the Israelites forever. Judah had twin sons, Perez and Zerah, and from the bloodline of Perez came King David, King Solomon, and the other kings in the land of Canaan. But those kings did not arise until many centuries after the prophecy. So where were the promised kings and rulers during these centuries? They came through Zerah, and they were not in the land of Canaan. Zerah's sons are listed. The sons of Zerah are Zimri, Ethan, Heman, Calcol, and Darda, 5 in all. But once these sons are named, they disappear from the Bible. Around the time of the Exodus from Egypt, Zerah is mentioned, and he is with his twin brother Perez, but only the sons of Perez are present. Meanwhile, in Greek history, at the same period, famous kings seem to appear out of nowhere with the same names as the sons of Zerah. A king Dardanius. Dardanius is the Greek version of Darda, arose in the Troad, the west coast of Turkey, where he founded a colony named Dardania. His people were the Dardanians. Of those children, Dardanus, who was a man who entertained great designs and was the first to make his way across to Asia in a makeshift boat, founded at the outset a city called Dardanus, organized a kingdom which he lay about the city, which was called Troy at a later time, and called the people Dardanians after himself. Darda's grandson named Tros founded the city of Troy, which he named after himself. The city of Troy and the Trojans became even more prosperous than Dardania and the Dardanians, and grew large and wealthy enough to eclipse them. So we can see that the Trojans were Israelites from the tribe of Judah, coming down through Zerah. The Romans originated from the Trojans. After the sacking of Troy by the Danaan Greeks, a remnant of Trojans fled Greece. They were led by Aeneas, a prince of Troy and cousin to the famous Hector of Troy. Aeneas and his men sailed around the Mediterranean and finally settled in Latinum, Italy. Aeneas married the daughter of the king of Latinum, and in time Aeneas became king and founded a dynasty of kings. The fact that the Trojan remnant settled in Latinum is the reason that later Roman language was called Latin, and centuries later a descendant of Aeneas named Romulus founded the city of Rome. At first, Rome was just another small town, but as time passed, Rome became a city, grew stronger, and began to conquer and absorb the surrounding city-states. Eventually, Rome became the Roman Republic, and then came the mighty Roman Empire, ruled over by emperors. Since the Trojans had founded Rome, and the Trojans came from Judah through Zerah, the Romans were also descendants of Judah, and thus were Israelites. The story of Aeneas, his journeys, the founding of Rome, and thus the descendants of Romans from Trojans, is confirmed by Strabo the historian, who states it as a traditional fact. Some of the Dardanians and Trojans also moved into Thrace, forming a kingdom called Dardania, whilst others moved further to the coast, eventually forming Illyria. As for the Greeks, they too were always colonizing the Mediterranean, much of southern Italy, the Mediterranean islands, and the western coast of Anatolia, which were hotly contested. Eventually, a new kingdom formed called Macedonia, which likely was a combination of the Danaans, Dorians, as well as the Dardanians and Trojans. It was this kingdom, of course, that went on to destroy the Persian Empire. The contention for western Anatolia is likely which led to the Milesians fleeing, and like the Tuatha De Danann, sailing through the Mediterranean and eventually arriving in Ireland. So overall we can see and understand why Solomon was compared to the sons of Zerah in wisdom. They had great dynasties and kingdoms in Europe, and Solomon was said to be even wiser than them all. Eventually these descendants of Zerah ruled the world under Rome, and then later with the Germanic tribes coming to possess Europe, the Germanic kings, who more than likely were descended from King David, came to rule. So by taking a closer look at history, we see that the Israelites spread all over Europe and Judah ruled over the Europeans. So just like the prophecy to Judah was foretold, 22. The Phoenician colonization of Europe. The Phoenicians arose around the time of the Judges. They were not a defined nation or kingdom, rather they were a confederation of maritime traders. They originated from the northern tribes of Israel and came primarily from Tyre and Sidon. They founded trading posts and port cities all over the Mediterranean coastlands, and they colonized areas that grew into city-states. The Phoenicians even established great nations such as Carthage. But this straightforward story of Israelites who took to the seas has been twisted into a deceptive tale by historians. It's taught that the Phoenicians were not Israelites but evil Canaanites, and it's supposed that they were a separate nation from the Israelites, and most modern biblical maps draw a separate nation called Phoenicia alongside the coastline of Israel. If this were true, it would follow logically that large parts of Europe that were settled by Phoenicians were actually settled by Canaanites. That is what modern Canaanites want us to believe. However, it's a complete fabrication. There was no Phoenicia in the Bible. Joshua and the Israelites conquered and occupied the coast of Palestine, as far south as Joppa, a port used by King Solomon, and as far north as Sidon. The Israelites drove the Canaanites out of Tyre and the other port cities, but not completely out of Sidon. Therefore the Phoenicians are Israelites, and only Israelites occupied the port cities from whence the Phoenicians came. But why were these maritime traders called Phoenicians and not just Israelites? Phoenician was a Greek geographical and commercial term. Most surviving historical material from this era was written by the Athenians, and they lacked full knowledge of the history of Israel. The traders who became known as the Phoenicians dealt in a purple dye found in the mollusks of sea snails on the coast of Israel. They also dyed their sails and clothing purple. So the Greeks called them Phoenicians, which comes from the Greek word phoenix, which means purple. From the Greek perspective, these traders were the purple people. During the Judges period, Tyre became semi-autonomous with the Kingdom of Israel. King Hiram ruled Tyre. Nevertheless, he submitted himself to King David, and this situation has been used to prove that Tyre was not Israelites. But that's not true. The Tyrians were indeed Israelites, even though they enjoyed some autonomy. Because they were Israelites, the account of Diodorus Siculus about the connection of Cadmus the Phoenician to Danaus the Egyptian, and both of them to Moses and the ancient Israelites in the Exodus, represents the truth. Although it may not be literally true, the Phoenicians and the Danaan Greeks both came from the Exodus, although they took different geographical paths than the Israelites who crossed the desert with Moses. Nevertheless, they were kin. Cadmus is said to have founded the city of Thebes in Greece, and he is credited by the ancient Greeks themselves with bringing the Hebrew Phoenician arts and letters to Greece. The Phoenicians colonized parts of Anatolia, Iberia, Spain, and reached as far as the British Isles. Even today, archaeology tells us that the Phoenicians were tin miners and traders in the Mediterranean. Once the Israelites were deported by the Assyrians, Carthage became the new dominant power of the Phoenicians, of many of the Phoenician colonies. It expanded even further into the Mediterranean, which eventually would lead to the Punic Wars with the Romans, who were also Israelites. The Phoenician language is the Hebrew language, but whether this script is labeled Phoenician or Hebrew depends on where the ancient tablet or inscription was found. If the artifact were found in Israel, it's called Hebrew, but artifacts found in Europe are suddenly labeled as Phoenician. The Antichrists do everything they can to separate the Phoenician from the true Israelites. They even claim that Phoenician is a Canaanite language, and this is not true. The Canaanites used cuneiform, the language of Aram, and this can easily be proven because the Canaanites wrote letters to the Egyptians in cuneiform, begging for help during Joshua's invasion. Only after Joshua's conquest of the Canaanites did Hebrew become the language used in that region. So once the lies are cleared up about the true identity of the Phoenicians, we clearly see that the Israelites are the ancestors of the Europeans. 23. Paganism identifies who the lost sheep are. The ancient Israelites continuously fell away from Yahweh and sank into paganism. Yahweh would then punish them and bring them back to his commandments. This cycle repeated again and again until the Israelites grew so unfaithful and corrupt that Yahweh divorced them and allowed them to be conquered and deported. In exile they forgot Yahweh and became pagans. But as the lost sheep Israelites they were, they could not forget the one true God completely. They projected vague memories of him and the religion of their ancestors into the paganism they adopted or developed. We find an example of this in the paganism of the Germanic tribes in Europe. But first, to really understand this phenomenon, we must know about the two trees in the Garden of Eden. The tree of life is Christ and his Adamic race. Yahweh is both the root of the tree and the branch, i.e. Christ. In contrast, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil is comprised of the fallen angels and their offspring. The serpent represents the leader of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. Initially, this was the fallen angels, and later it included the descendants of Cain. These two trees are at constant war with each other, and will be until the end of time and the final triumph of Christ. In the meantime, the descendants of Cain are constantly trying to wipe out the tree of life, and they have succeeded in destroying all the branches except for the Israelites, who are the Europeans. With that background in mind, we can better understand the Germanic pagan literature recording in the Eddas about Odin as an example of what we're talking about. Odin is the good god, and he had a son called Thor. Fighting against them is the evil god Loki and a Midgard serpent, also called the world serpent, that is circling the earth. In the end times, called Ragnarok, a great battle will take place between Odin and Loki. Thor will be returned and defeat the serpent. This concept of a mighty serpent standing in opposition to God and mankind is also a theme of the Bible. When we compare the story of Thor defeating the serpent to Revelation 20, we find great similarities. Yahweh as Yahshua returns to battle and destroy the great serpent, or in other words, Christ defeats and destroys the fallen angels and their descendants, and thus saves his people Israel, who are being overrun by all directions by these evil enemies. The name Loki is a shortened form of Lucifer. In Old Latin, the C was always hard, like our K. The Latin C is always transliterated as the Greek K, so Loki or Lucky is short for Lucifer, which is probably where we get the word lucky from. In some accounts, Loki had three children, the wolf Fenris, the world serpent, and Hell. In scripture, the children of Satan are compared to wolves. Collectively, they are the serpent, and in many ways they represent hell and death, as the devil is said to have the power of death. So it certainly seems that Loki may have been introduced into the Germanic myth in the Christian era. In addition, the word Odin is cognate with the Hebrew title Adon, or Lord. Odin was a real historical figure who lived around the 3rd century AD. He founded a kingdom in Scandinavia and northern western Germany, and divided this kingdom amongst his sons when he died. In the ancient Saxon chronicles, the kings of Sweden, Denmark, Norway, Saxony and Germany, and the Anglo-Saxon England all reckoned their genealogy in the number of generations since they had descended from Odin. This same Odin was said to have led his people from Asa, which can be identified as Asia Minor. Very likely, Odin was a tribal king of the Scythians who dwelt along the south coast of the Black Sea. Furthermore, according to Bede, Anglo-Saxon Christians in Britain were bringing the gospel of Christ to northern Germany even before his time, and at least as early as the 7th century AD, long before the Eddas were set down in writing by Snorri in the 13th century. Lastly, the Germanic Eddas tell the myth of a great battle between the Aesir gods and the Vanir gods, Odin being one of the Aesirs. It is likely that Roman Asia is the Asa or Asir of the Eddas. The Asir may be identified as Scythians who had migrated into northern Europe through Roman Asia from the region of the Pontus, and the Vanir may be Scythians who had migrated from the area around Lake Van, which was further east and under the control of the Parthians. 24. Most traditional English names are from biblical figures. Most European Christian names are drawn from the Bible. We've used these names for centuries. Our godly ancestors hoped that their children would live up to these names. Biblical names such as Peter, Andrew, James, and John, all apostles of Christ. Where were the apostles and followers called Jamal or Shakisha or Tyrone or Abu, Muhammad, and Wong? Even from our European names, it is obvious that the Bible is naturally tied to the European people and not the other peoples. Other male biblical names include Simon, Philip, Thomas, Matthew, Mark, Paul, Luke, Stephen, Timothy, and from the Old Testament, Adam, Aaron, Benjamin, Dan, Daniel, Jacob, and Jonathan. Female names include Mary, Elizabeth, Anna, Chloe, Hannah, Lydia, Naomi, Rebecca, Rachel, Sarah, Suzanne, and many more. And whilst not immediately obvious, many shortened names are derived from longer biblical names, such as Eli is short for Elijah, Jack for Jacob, Jerry or Jared for Jeremiah, Joe or Joey from Joseph, Toby for Tobiah, Zach from Zechariah, and so on. All of these names are intrinsic to European culture and heritage. Most would be unknown in Europe had it not been for our preservation of Scripture. Non-Europeans would have never heard of these biblical names had we not forcefully Christianized them. Furthermore, many of the names in the New Testament were actually Greek and Roman. Stephen, the first martyr, was a Greek name, and Luke or Lucas, the gospel writer, was a Roman name. This shows the intrinsic relationship and common culture shared by the Israelites in Judea and the Greek and Roman Israelites. It also shows that the Europeans are the people of the Bible and that the gospel was spread only to Europeans. It's in our very names. 25. Peter called the Europeans an elect race and a royal priesthood. Peter wrote his first epistle to Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia. These Asia Minor locations were populated by white Romans, Greeks, and Galatians. Peter referred to them collectively as a chosen race, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, a peculiar people. Only the Israelites were chosen to be an elect race and royal priesthood. Peter goes on that you should show forth the praises of him who have called you out of darkness into his marvelous light. Yes, the Israelites had been divorced, cast off, and no longer had a shepherd, so they were in darkness. Yahweh had withdrawn his mercy during the Assyrian deportations, but now in Christ the Israelites were being shown mercy once again, and Peter continued, which in time past were not a people, but are now the people of God, which had not obtained mercy, but now have obtained mercy. Peter is actually quoting Yahweh's words to the Israelites through Moses. Now therefore, if you will obey my voice indeed and keep my covenant, then you shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine, and you shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. These are the words which thou shalt speak unto the children of Israel. The fact that Peter used these same words shows us that he believed the Europeans were the Israelites, the same people Moses had addressed. In this kingdom of priests, every Israelite male was the priest of his household, and collectively the Israelites were a holy nation or people. Yahweh had separated and consecrated them to himself, and specifically commanded them never to intermingle with the other peoples. Later in this verse, Peter quoted Hosea chapter 1. God commanded Hosea to marry a prostitute. She was to be a type of Israel who had played the harlot, and Hosea had children with his wife, and Hosea was told what to name his child. Call his name Lo-Ami, for you are not my people, and I will not be your God. Thus Yahweh denounced the former kingdom of Israel and foretold that they would lose their identity in their captivity. However, he promised, yet the number of the children of Israel shall be as the sand of the sea, which cannot be measured nor numbered. And it shall come to pass that in the place where it was said unto them, you are not my people, there it shall be said unto them, ye are the sons of the living God. Here Peter is declaring that the Christians are named after the living God because Christ is God. Thus he is reaffirming that the Europeans are fulfilling Hosea's prophecy. They are the true Israelites who were formerly disowned, but are now reunited with God in Christ. Hosea said more about the great regathering of the children of Israel. Then shall the children of Judah and the children of Israel be gathered together, and appoint themselves one head, and they shall come up out of the land, for great shall be the day of Jezreel. This shows that Christianity regathered and reunited Israel and Judah. This reunion can only be the Europeans who became the great and holy nation of Christendom. No other people were cast off by Yahweh and then regathered by him. Peter is identifying the Europeans as those people. The Europeans, and only the Europeans, were the lost sheep, now reconciled to their God through Christ. None of this applies to any other people. 26. True Israelites, divorced and dispersed, could never resettle in Palestine. Yahweh warned that the deported Israelites would never resettle Palestine. In fact, Palestine would become a hedge of thorns that would block their path if they tried. Here Yahweh was using thorns as an allegory for mixed people who would overrun the Middle East and block any Israelites trying to return and rebuild their original homeland. In Hosea chapter 2, Yahweh rebuked Israel at length. First he declared that he was divorcing Israel. Plead with your mother, plead, for she is not my wife, neither am I her husband. Let her therefore put away her whoredoms out of her sight, and her adulteries from between her breasts. Here ancient Israel was the mother, and the Israelites going into deportations were her children. Yahweh then chastised Israel for intermixing with foreign people, and especially the Canaanites. And I will not have mercy upon her children, for they be children of whoredoms. In this way Yahweh showed that he only cared for his own people and not for bastards. This parallels perfectly with Yahshua's warning against fornication in Revelation chapter 2. And I have given her time in order that she, Israelites, would repent, yet she did not wish to repent from her fornication. Later the bastards produced through fornication would be destroyed, and I shall slay her children, those of fornication, with death. Later on in that same chapter, Hosea talks about a sin that is completely overlooked by modern Bible commentators. For their mother have played the harlot, she that conceived them have done shamefully. For she said, I will go after my lovers, that give me my bread and my water, my wool and my flax, mine oil and my drink. Here Yahweh is angered at not only the intermingling, but also the international trade the Israelites had been engaged in. Today we Israelites are doing the exact same thing, but on a much larger scale. This has resulted in the roaming vagabond descendants of Cain gaining complete control over our countries. The Israelites were intended to be a separate holy people, and that has not changed. Yahweh proclaimed the punishment, therefore behold, I will hedge up thy way with thorns and make a wall, that she shall not find her path. The Canaanites, who were amongst the mixed races of Palestine, whom the children of Israel were commanded to exterminate, were called pricks and thorns. The children of Israel were warned, if they did not destroy them, every last one of them, that they would become pricks and thorns upon them. Later in the gospel, Christ used them as an example. Once he said that we will know men by their fruits, and asked whether men should gather grapes from thorns or figs from thistles. Next, Yahweh declared that the Israelites would try to seek out their former trade partners again, and she shall follow after her lovers, but she shall not overtake them, and she shall seek them, but shall not find them. Then she shall say, I will go and return to my first husband, for then it was better with me than now. The lovers of ancient Israel were Egypt, Babylonia, Persian, and Assyria, etc. And Yahweh destroyed them all like a vengeful husband. They were never found again. But Yahweh had mercy on his wife, the Israelites, and redeemed her. If Yahweh destroyed these people and nations, then logically anyone living in those regions now cannot call themselves the Egyptians, Babylonians, Persians, and Assyrians. However, with the knowledge that eventually Arabia overran and totally destroyed all of these nations, we see that this prophecy took a very long time to be fulfilled, and the result was thorns and thistles destroying the former nations and people by intermixing and replacing them. Eventually, a wall of thorns did appear and encompass the entire Middle East. Despite their efforts to win back the Middle East, the European Crusades were always doomed to fail. Whenever they tried to reclaim the once Christian Palestine and drive back the hordes who had overrun it and were encroaching into Europe, they failed. Ultimately, they lost out for two reasons. Europe was never unified in its interest, and those who tried to retake the Middle East for Christendom could not overcome the pricks and thorns. But this fulfilled the prophecy that Israel would never resettle the promised land. Yahweh had other plans and glories planned on for the Israelites in Europe. 27 European nations, cities and settlements still with Hebrew names. Our Israelite ancestors left traces of the Hebrew language in place names all across Europe. Denmark, for example, means the territory of Dan. The rivers Danube, Don and Dnieper still bear the name of the tribe of Dan. The Crimea in Ukraine gets its name from the Cimmerians, who passed through those lands on their way to Europe, and the Welsh still call themselves the Cymry after the Cimmerians, a branch of whom crossed over the North Sea into Britain. In more ancient times, Spain was called Iberia and Ireland Hibernia. Both names were derived from the Hebrew word Iber, which means the other side. From the coast of Israel, Spain was the other side of the Mediterranean, and so was Ireland if you sailed north from Spain. These names were bequeathed by the Israelite maritime Phoenicians with their perspective of the other side as they colonized Europe from the time of the Judges. It was only natural that they would name places in their Hebrew tongue. Carthage meant new city in Hebrew. Its original name was Kiryat Hadesh, and it was an offshoot of the city Tyre, an Israelite port. The Romans corrupted the name to Carthage. The prefix Kar is the word for a city. In Britain, the Phoenician settlements also had the Hebrew names with this prefix, such as Cardiff and Carlisle. At one time, many places in Britain began with Kar, which was sometimes transliterated as Care. In Ireland, many places' names contain the word Baal, Bel, or Bali, which likely originated from the Hebrew name Baal. After King David and Solomon reigned over Israel, the Israelites began falling into paganism, especially under King Jeroboam in the northern kingdom. They began to worship Baal, so it should be no surprise that the Phoenician settlers in Europe would bring this paganism with them. Names such as Belfast, Belgrade, Bel Air resemble the name Baal, as do biblical city names such as Baal Berith, Baal Hazor, Baal Hanan, Baal Hermon, Baal Gad, and so on. Some sources claim that the word Bel meant ford, and that Bali is a Gaelic word meaning towel, but the Hebrew influence is there, and those translations may be more than just a coincidence. If we look carefully, we see that our Hebrew ancestors left clues of us in many European place names. It's no accident that these names are Hebrew. Rather, it proves that the ancient Israelites came to Europe, settled here, and named places after themselves or in their own language. The lasting message of these place names is that Europe was settled by ancient Israelites, and we remain the true Israelites of today. 28. The Scottish Declaration of Arbroath. The Scottish Declaration of Arbroath is the most famous document in Scottish history. It declares the Scots to be the descendants of the children of Israel. In other words, Israelites. Written in 1320 AD, the diplomatic letter was addressed to Pope John the 22nd and begged his help and protection against the English kings, who were bent on conquering Scotland. And one portion reads, "Most Holy Father, the Lord, i.e. the Pope, we know, and from the chronicles and books of the ancients we find that among other famous nations, our own, the Scots, have been graced with widespread renown. They journeyed from Great Scythia by the way of the Tyrrhenian Sea and the Pillars of Hercules, and dwelt for a long course of time in Spain among the most savage tribes, but nowhere could they be subdued by any race, however barbarous. Thence we came 1200 years after the people of Israel crossed the Red Sea to their home in the west, where they still live today. The Britons they first drove out, the Picts they utterly destroyed, and even though very often assailed by the Norwegians, the Danes and the English, they took possession of that home with many victories and untold efforts, and as the historians of old time bear witness, they have held it free of all bondage ever since." So not only did the Scots identify themselves with the Scythians, but they reckoned their timeline according to the Exodus. only Israelites would use that timeline. Great Scythia was above the Caucasus Mountains to the west, so it was certainly possible to sail from there through the Mediterranean around Spain and then to Scotland. The timeline is slightly off probably, but Scots in the 14th century lacked access to the vast information we have today. The declaration was written in 1320 AD, so dating their arrival into Scotland between the 1st century BC and the 1st century AD is fair enough. When the Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the Picts, the early Scots in the 1st century AD, he noted that the tall red-haired Caledonians, the Scots, of his time betrayed their Scythian origins. In other words, the Scots and the Scythians had a strikingly similar appearance and culture. Our adversaries come up with various harebrained lies to try and hide our truer history. For example, they claim that we Europeans lived in Europe from ancient times as backward cavemen. These kind of deceptions divert our attention from the large migrations of our people out of the Middle East. They want to deceive us into believing that we are not the true Israelites, but we are all Europeans, including the Scots, originated from the ancient Israelites. 29 Christian churches worldwide only in white nations. Since Christ walked the earth and his gospel spread across Europe, only the European people have built churches and worshipped him as their God. This fact continues to this day. Nevertheless, a deception lingers in once white locations that are now overrun. One such location is Ethiopia. 2 periods of church building took place in Ethiopia. The first dates no later than the 6th century, when the population was still white. The second dates no earlier than the 16th century, when the Jesuit missionaries came and built churches. Like other non-European people, the Ethiopians never built or maintained churches themselves. In between these 2 dates was only stagnation. If not for the original white population and the later white missionary interference, Christianity in Ethiopia would be non-existent or unrecognizable. As further proof that non-Europeans never built churches, the artwork found in the 6th century churches in Ethiopia depict Christ, his apostles, and other early Christians as white, although with perhaps some Arab influences at times. Simply put, Greek and Roman colonies had moved to Ethiopia and they had built the churches. We do not see other peoples depicted in Ethiopian church art until the later modern churches from the 16th century, which were built by Jesuits. Therefore, modern Ethiopian Christianity is not authentically ancient, rather it is a relic of European colonizations. If the Ethiopians were truly Christians all along, they would not have needed Western assistance to build their churches or to organize their communities, and this principle applies to all other non-European nations out there. We can see other examples in Mexico and the South Americas. Churches in those lands were built by early Spanish and Portuguese colonizers, and these nations, even Mexico, originally had huge white European populations, but they gradually diminished. Either they were mixed out of existence or fled to North America. And as the European-looking people disappeared, the living conditions in those nations have declined enormously, and many of those regions become hellholes. If the non-Europeans had truly been Christian and remained Christian, they would have built thriving civilizations, even after the Europeans fled. But why should we be surprised at their failures? Christ told us, "You will know them by their fruits," as well as a good tree cannot produce bad fruit, and a bad tree cannot produce good fruit. Across history, the churches that we Europeans built worldwide stand as a testimony that we truly were Christian and were the only Christians and still are the only true Christians today. We can be judged favorably by our good fruits since the time of Christ, but this was all according to divine plan, as Yahweh only came for the Israelites. We shouldn't expect anyone else. The Europeans prove what Christ said about only a good tree, the Israelites, can produce good fruit. 30 Israelites to be the chief among all the nations. Yahweh promised the Israelites that if they obeyed him, he would make them the greatest nations ever to exist. The Israelites were destined to be the chief among the nations, to be a light shining on a hill, and to rule the world. But near the end times, the time of Jacob's trouble, this would all change. The treacherous descendants of Cain would gain control over all the Israelite nations and seek to destroy them. Only the European Israelites fit these prophecies, we have ruled the world, but now all of our governments have been subverted. Whilst this prophecy of greatness was originally given to Abraham, the Israelites were given the details in Deuteronomy 28. And it shall come to pass, if thou shalt hearken diligently unto the voice of Yahweh thy God, to observe and to do all his commandments which I command thee this day, that Yahweh thy God will set thee on high above all nations of the earth, and all these blessings shall come on thee and overtake thee, if thou shalt hearken unto the voice of Yahweh thy God. By David and Solomon's times, the Israelites had been raised above all nations, but this did not last. They turned away from Yahweh and his law, and God dispersed them among the nations. But once the Israelites in Europe had been reconciled to Yahweh through Christianity, they were once again elevated above all nations, and this was predominantly in the form of the German Holy Roman Empire, then the British Empire, and currently the American Empire. Although there has always been the nefarious descendants of Cain, bankers, supporting these empires behind the scenes for their own gain, nevertheless the Israelites have enjoyed the status of world hegemony as Yahweh promised.